Thank you very much, Shanti. Thank you everyone for coming to the last colloquium. Thank you to the Rachel Carson Center for having me here. Having time to research and write is critical, especially for burnt out academics. And I've only been here for a few weeks, but this huge weight has lifted from my shoulders. It's just amazing being here, so thank you. I also need to mention I'm quite deaf. So I have no hearing in my left ear and I have half in my right. I wear a hearing aid. I got meningitis when I was 4. That's when you have an infection on the lining of your brain. And to kill that infection, they gave me some antibiotics, and the antibiotics damaged my hearing. So when we have questions afterwards, I'm not going to be able to hear you. I can only hear about a metre away. So I have a little mic which will pass around and you speak into that, and it connects to my hearing aid with Bluetooth. I know I don't sound deaf. I've had a lot of speech therapy. Not every deaf person has a speech impediment, so it always pays to speak clearly because the person you are speaking to might only be hearing half of what you're saying. Okay, so let's get going, and here's my clicker. I am an Australian, which at the moment is a source of great embarrassment and anxiety. Half the country is in flames. In New South Wales alone, 3 million hectares have burnt. And this is a protest that happened a couple of years ago with the Prime Minister before the last one, 2 Prime Ministers ago, called Tony Abbott, and they're protesting his inaction on Australia's climate policies by putting their head in the sand. This is in Queensland, Cairns. Then we got another Prime Minister and he tried to do something about climate change and he got booted out. Now we have Scott Morrison, who thought it was funny to bring a lump of coal into Parliament. And while the country is in flames, he's gone on holidays. And this is a meme someone has created which says, "I'll be back for the Ashes," and the Ashes is an Australian cricket game. So my response to this embarrassing political situation is to write. So I've published 2 novels, Penguin, and I've published a memoir about deafness, which came out 6 months ago. And I'm currently working on 2 projects. So I'm writing a scholarly book about eco-criticism here at the Rachel Carson Center. And then when I've finished, I've got residencies in Scotland and America to finish my current work in progress, creative non-fiction, which is an ecobiography of Western Australia's first female scientist. That's her, Georgiana Malloy. And I'm going to begin here in southwest Western Australia. It's not where I'm from, but it's where she landed in 1830, and they were the first white people in the area. And these are the Noongar groups, the traditional custodians of that area. And this area is known to botanists as the Southwest Australian Floristic Region, so the SWAFR for short. And I'm starting here because this is where my research is based, and that's kind of prompted me to start researching ecobiography. So the SWAFR stretches for roughly 300,000 kilometres across this southwestern corner of Western Australia. And its landscape is old and weathered, and it's persisted for millions of years because it hasn't been disrupted by earthquakes or volcanoes. And without disturbance or replenishment through this geographical upheaval, the soil has become very poor in nutrients, but it's given rise to this incredible diversity of plant forms. And so to ensure survival in the region, there's very specific relationships have been created, such as this one between the thinning wasp and the dwarf hammer orchid, which is Dracea macrantha. So the orchids release plumes of pheromones that trick a male wasp into thinking that this plant is female. And the wasp tracks the plume in a zigzagging flight, and then it lands on the flower and it tries to copulate with it because it thinks it's a lady. And then it gets coated in pollen and it flies to another flower and it transmits that pollen, so it fertilises the plant. And these wasps and orchids demonstrate in a very vivid and beautiful way the interdependence in an ecosystem, which can be defined as a biological system composed of all the organisms found in a particular environment interacting with it and with each other. Now, more than 2 centuries of European colonisation in this area has drastically impacted on the ecosystems, and particularly the ecosystems that support orchids, and more members of this species have been affected than any other plant family. And so to protect the other than human inhabitants of this unique region, such as the dwarf hammer orchid and the wasp, the scientists have advocated for its recognition as a biodiversity hotspot, which is an area in which high percentages of plant life found nowhere else on Earth are at risk of extinction, exceptional risk of extinction. And so the SWAFA was declared a biodiversity hotspot in 2000, one of two in Australia. And while scientists are undertaking crucial research on the importance of the SWAFA, writers and scholars can also create and promote new ways of thinking about ecosystems and our place within them, rather than assuming, as anthropocentrism has maintained, that ecosystems are valuable insofar as they only serve humans. And one such way is through transforming autobiography, or the stories we tell about ourselves, in ways that rethink anthropocentric approaches to human and non-human lives. As you likely know, a number of scholars have written with intelligence and verve on the shared materiality of the human and the other than human. So we've got Donna Haraway, Anna Singh and Jane Bennett, for example. But given the context of my research and Georgiana Malloy, I've opened with this local example of the interdependence of self and ecosystem to illuminate my approach to the ecobiography I'm writing about this botanist and the SWAFA in which she collected. So Dracea macrantha is not listed among her specimens, but these remarkable relationships between pollinators and their flowers were responsible for the creation of the flora that radically transformed her sense of self. I could talk about that like in question time. I don't have time to talk about that in this paper itself. But I've been writing this book for 2 decades, and while I've been trying to work out how to put it together, the way that she interacted with her environment, the way the wasp and the orchid have interacted, has prompted me to rethink the origins of autobiography. So life writing is the field in which I work, and for those of you who aren't familiar with life writing, it's what it says on the tin. It's non-fictional life writing about life. So we've got autobiography, biography, memoir, letters, journals and diaries. And Sydney Smith and Julia Watson open their key text in the field of life writing studies. It's called Reading Autobiography, a guide for interpreting life narratives. They open their book with a reference to the Greek etymology of the term autobiography. So autos denotes self, bios denotes life, and graphe denotes writing. So it's a neat definition of self-life writing. And the term emerged in the West in the late 18th and early 19th century, and analyses of this form have historically been drawn seamlessly into supporting the belief and values of an essentialist or romantic notion of selfhood, in which a unified self is seen as representative of universal human nature. And this interpretation of autobiography is one that is emphatically and definitively anthropocentric, so human life is at its core. But scholarship on post-humanism has destabilised the concept of a universal subject, and it's queried where the self begins and ends. As the introduction to a special issue of the journal Biography on post-human lives indicates, the critical approaches of feminism, post-colonialism, post-structuralism, queer theory, postmodernism and disability studies all have influenced recent criticism by raising questions about the status of the human subject and subjectivity. And the effect of this, as post-humanist scholar Rosie Braidotti notes, is that it compels us to question what exactly is the basic unit of common reference for our species, our polity, and our relationships to the other inhabitants of this planet. So these cultural shifts suggest that the human is not, and never has been, a unified, isolated subject. And I maintain that if we can't have a life without the lives of other inhabitants, such as fungi, bacteria, air or orchids, then it becomes desirable in creating an autobiography to include the lives that sustain and shape it. So the autos of a biography should include an environment. And a literary representation of this relationship is known as ecobiography. So it's not just an autobiography of an environment, but it details the imbrication of a human self with that environment, and it renders the lives of the inhabitants, not just the human inhabitants, but the other than human inhabitants, with significance and vibrancy. So the term first appeared 1996 in an essay From Walden Pond to Great Salt Lake. Ecobiography and Engendered Species Acts in Walden and Refuge. And so the authors, Farr and Snyder, describe ecobiography as a life story constructed according to a pattern divined internally through the self's interaction with the external environment, especially nature, the multiple exchanges of which represent a kind of ecosystem of the self. And in these life stories, they continue, it is impossible to tell where the self ends and nature begins, or where nature ends and the self begins. Ego and eco are inextricably intertwined. So in layman's terms, what distinguishes ecobiography from, for example, straight autobiography or environmental history is that it focuses specifically on how the self has been shaped by the environment, and how it is obvious in reading ecobiographies that the human self is not able to live without that environment, either physically or psychically. But in the 2 decades since the term was created, there's been remarkably little critical attention to the form and what it constitutes. I think that's because of the entrenched anthropocentrism of life writing. So this is what I'm trying to rectify by writing this book at the Rachel Carson Center. But of the criticism that has been published to date, there's 2 main themes. So that's the dissolution of boundaries between the human and the other than human, and there's attention to local environments and ecosystems. And some other themes that I've found coming up include the materiality of the author's subject matter and how that influences the way the text is written, and the idea of an inheritance. So that's both a personal inheritance and an ecological inheritance. So now I'm going to talk briefly about 3 ecobiographies which I've studied and written about, how these themes come out in the works. So I've done a rough draft of 3 chapters, and I need to write another 4. And I'm looking at examples from different countries because I don't want it to be too Anglophone. And so far I've got Australia, Scotland, England and America, and I need to find examples from Germany, Southeast Asia and South America. So please have a think and let me know at the end if anything comes to mind. So my first example is Kim Mahood's Position Doubtful, published in 2016. And in her late childhood, Mahood's family moved to what they named Mongrel Downs, which was a cattle station situated some 700 kilometres northwest of Alice Springs in the Tanami Desert. And in 1992, the station was returned to its traditional owners and renamed Tanami Downs. And Mahood's father died in a helicopter crash when she was fairly young, as a young woman. So she made a pilgrimage back to this country. She described it in her first memoir, Craft for a Dry Lake, that was published in 2000. And the trip morphed into annual journeys which included artist field trips, visits to Mahood's former family home on the cattle station, volunteer work in the Indigenous Arts Centre at Balgo, an artist residency at the Tanami mine, and map-making expeditions and environmental projects with the Wallumajarri custodians of Lake Gregory. So Mahood describes these journeys in her book, Position Doubtful, focusing on how her years spent with the Wallumajarri people as a young girl and then later as a woman shaped the way she perceived the country and herself. She says that her ecobiography is, quote, a kind of love story for a remote pocket of inland Australia, end of quote. And she says the desert, quote, took up residence in my psyche when I was very young in an impersonal, obdurate sort of way that made it impossible for me to form lasting attachments to any other place, end of quote. And it also transformed her visual perspective and the way she perceived the natural world. So she uses art and writing to express what she describes as the improvised life I have chosen to live for the past 20 years, straddling 2 worlds and settling in neither. So one world is the city and the other world is the Aboriginal world and the thinly populated world of the desert. And when she was a baby, she was given the skin name of Naparula, which means that she belongs to the skin group with traditional links to Tanami Downs. And when she returns to the desert on repeated trips, she tries to negotiate her relationships with the women she's grown up with, and one of them, a Walpiri woman, Patricia. And she says about this relationship, quote, between us hovers something that is not quite friendship, which stems from an awareness of the ambivalent ground we occupy, Our shared connection to country carries with it some form of mutual obligation, the nature of which I am uncertain, end of quote. So her position is doubtful, and that comes through in the text. I'm going to talk about that a bit later. So she arrives at this motif of the grid in her art practice. That's her there with her dog Pirate, and this is one of her images here. She's trying to orient herself in this place, and she's trying to come up with a visual way of explaining how this is inflected by her interactions with Walmatjari people. So in 1993, she stood before Indigenous paintings for the first time in the Holmes Court collection of Vasse Felix in southwestern Western Australia. And she saw how the country was represented in a way that spoke directly of its essence. But at the same time, she recognised that, quote, here was an iconography and an organising principle that perfectly expressed my experience of the country in which I had grown up, end of quote. But she knew she couldn't use it because she wasn't Indigenous. And she says the ancestral imprint that gave the desert painting such authority and power was not available to me, end of quote. So she needed to find an equivalent in her own culture, and this led her to two critical elements of the Western visual tradition, the grid and the horizon line. And she meditates on the motif of the grid, which you can see here, and she says, quote, the grid has had a bad press as a colonial tool, especially when applied to mapping, but that is only part of the story. The mapping grid that is based on latitude and longitude distorts the shape of continents when it is used as the basis for a two-dimensional map. But the coordinates it represents, north, south and east and west, are embedded in the natural world, the rising and setting of the sun and moon, the axis on which the planet spins, end of quote. So her receptiveness to the alternative capacities of the grid, particularly in terms of its connection to the natural world, means that she's open to modes of seeing that are alternative to those that are inherent in the Western arts visual tradition. And one of the projects she becomes involved with is the Canning Stock Route Art Project, which aims to tell the story of the stock route through Indigenous Australian voices. And the route was between Halls Creek and Wiluna, and it was established in the early 20th century to move stock from the north to Western Australia. And so the Puruku artists, Indigenous artists in the project, paint their responses to their country and the section of the route that falls under the jurisdiction of the Eastern Walmatjari people. And when she watches them, Mahfoud writes that she feels, quote, a force field in which the gestures of laying paint on the canvas completes a circuit that begins and ends with the country, the body of the painter serving as a transformer to direct some of that perpetual current into a visible expression of the charge it carries, end of quotes. So the Puruku artist's maps are not a means of inscribing the land in terms of its utility as capital, but rather they're writing the country with art, so through themselves and of themselves. And I think in the text that Mahfoud's doing this too, but I'm going to come back to that later when I talk about characteristics of the text. So my second example is The Outrun by Scottish author Amy Liptrot, that was published in 2015. And in this she uses the geography of the Orkney Isles to describe her experiences of alcoholism. And as a girl, she writes, she sought extremes. Climbing up stone dikes and, quote, onto the roof shed, I threw my body from high rafters onto hail or wool bags below. Later, I plunged myself into parties, alcohol, drugs, relationships, sex, wanting to taste the extremes and not worrying about the consequences, always seeking sensation and raging against those who warned me away from the edge. My life was rough and windy and tangled. And this conceptualisation of her life as edgy and untamed is mirrored in the outrun of her parents' farm. So outrun is a verb and it means to go beyond and to exceed, and it's also a noun. So it's the rough grazing land on the furthest reaches of a property. And it's only semi-tamed, and it's where domestic and wild animals coexist. And she says humans don't often visit there because there's spirits roaming. And the edge of the farm, of her parents' farm, is also rimmed by the edge of the island. So things keep falling off the edge. So there's She talks about a dog that just runs off the cliff and into the sea, and a man who doesn't leave the brake on his tractor, and it too goes over the edge. And so there's a huge amount of wind in the area, and she says the westerly gales are the worst, bringing the sea with them, and tons of rock can be moved overnight, the map altered in the morning. And so both these themes, like this sense of a force beyond an individual's control, and also the idea of falling off a cliff, presage the events that happen in the rest of the book. So as she grows into a young woman, all Liptrot wants to do is escape and get away to the city. She calls it the hot pulse of the city, and she wants to seek and experience its sensations. And once she gets there, she throws herself into alcohol and parties, and it gets a sense in the book that she's always moving, and she's trying to reach beyond herself. So on nights when she hasn't had enough to drink, she pedals through London, and she says, I never felt sad when I was on my bicycle. And so she keeps cycling to chase this sensation of escape. And eventually the alcohol causes her relationship to break down, and then she gets assaulted while she's drunk, and so she checks into rehab, and then she moves back to the Orkneys. And she finds a job working with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and she's tracking this threatened species, the corncrake. And the bird's been on the island for thousands of years, but in the last century population is decimated, I think because the tractors run over their nests. And when she's doing this work, her body becomes a metaphor for ecology. And so she talks about how an ecosystem can lose resilience after repeated assaults. And she writes, quote, the corncrakes are struggling against death, and somehow it is as if my fate becomes intertwined with that of the bird. I'm trying to cling to a normal life and stay sober, and they are clinging to existence, end of quote. And so Liptrot is saved by the Orkney Islands themselves. So she's desperate for a bottle of wine one night after she's been up looking for corncrakes. And she says, quote, it's a good thing the island has no 24-hour off licenses, end of quote. So she physically can't get a drink. There's nothing there. And during the winter, she stays on Pape, which is an island even further afield to north of the mainland. And she keeps tracking the birds, and she keeps trying to keep up her routine without alcohol. And so instead of drinking now, she takes up sea swimming as a substitute, and she says, quote, the motivations are the same, but my methods of dealing with the way I feel are changing. I used to confuse my neurotransmitters on a Friday night in a hot nightclub. Now I shock my senses on a Saturday morning in a biting sea, plunging warm skin into cold water, forcing a rush of sensation, cleansed, end of quote. And then she uses similar terminology when she goes snorkeling, and she says, quote, I enter a new ecosystem, stimulating my thoughts and senses, shaking myself out of my sad routine, end of quote. So you can see how she's rendering the entwinement of her life with the natural world, and how that entwinement is integral to her survival. And that entwinement's also there in my third example, which is Lab Girl by Hope Yaren's American, and that was published in 2016. And it's a bit different to the other two because it's not centred so strongly on one location. Rather, it uses the metaphor trees to explain how nature is intrinsic to our survival. And it's a very funny book. I recommend you all read it if you want something good to read over Christmas. And that's unusual in life writing in the Anthropocene because everything is about death and dying. So it was beautifully done. And so she uses the growth of a tree to map her growth to adulthood and her career as a geobiologist. And she illuminates the entwinement of her life with the arboreal lives that she studies. And so after many hard years of hard work, she acquires enough experience and academic acclaim and funding to set up her own lab, but it's a precarious business. And so to describe how difficult it is to stay afloat, she opens a chapter with the line, quote, the life of a deciduous tree is ruled by its annual budget, end of quote. And then she explains what she's talking about. And she says, quote, every year during the short months from March to July, it must grow an entire new canopy of leaves. If it fails to meet its quota that year, some competitor will grow into a corner of its previous space and thus initiate the long, slow process by which the tree will eventually lose its foothold and die, end of quote. And then she segues into this description of how the tree consumes light and nutrients, water, and then she swings back to that opening line and she says, quote, "The life of an academic scientist is ruled by her 3-year budget. Every 3rd year, she must solicit a new contract with the federal government," end of quote. Now, as academics, we can all relate to this. But for the general reader, she's comparing tree life to human life, and she's educating readers about trees and how they use their resources and survive, and humans do that as well. And so not only does she discuss the impact of trees on her own life, she also encourages the readers to contemplate the lives of trees and trees in their own right. So she says, a tree's wood is also its memoir. So the rings on each piece, quote, describe how the rain fell and the wind blew and the sun appeared every day at dawn, end of quote. So she says that when we see wooden furniture, we're seeing a memoir of the tree because of the story told in the grain of the wood. So if trees have stories, then that makes us mindful that they are living beings just like humans are. And so trees are important because of their stories and because of the ways in which they shape our lives. But there's another significant reason. This is Jaren in her lab. There's another significant reason why trees and humans are impossible to separate, and that's because without the autos, or that self of trees, life is imperiled. And Jaren writes, quote, "Since 1990, we have created more than 8 billion new tree stumps. If we continue to fell healthy trees at this rate, less than 600 years from now, every tree on the planet will have been reduced to a stump," end of quote. So if one compares 600 years to 470 million years, which is when plants first emerged, you become aware of how close extinction is to our doorstep. So it's 120 generations if a generation is measured in 25 years, as opposed to nearly 19 million generations since plants began. So extinction means not just the extinction of plants, but the extinction of our and other than human selves, because plants give us the sugar and oxygen to stay alive. So this brings me to some of the overarching themes and characteristics of these books. And one of these is how they show nature is integral not only to our psychic survival but also our physical survival. And this explains one of the main characteristics of ecobiography, which is the representation of the dissolution of the boundaries between self and nature. And Kim Mahood has this opening paragraph in her book, which I think is a perfect encapsulation of ecobiography. She says, "To learn the names of trees and grasses, the times of their seeding and flowering, the glimpse they offer into the grand, slow cycles of nature, is to see your own life written there and passing. To know the geography of a place is to know why we have always made stories in which our own human self is indivisible from the stones and creeks and hills and growing things." So in this sense, we not only write the stories of our environment, but they write us. And I think this paragraph recalls the observation Mahood made about the Paruku people when they made their art. It comes through the country and their bodies and their lives. And the sense of dissolution is there in the outrun when Liptrott's trying to reach beyond the edges of herself. At the same time, she experiences the wind and the waves, the energy as part of her body. So there's no distinction between the wind and herself. And in Lab Girl, it's there in Jaren's depiction of the centrality of the trees to her emotional and intellectual life, and also to human life. So we won't survive without them. So this brings me to another theme, which is the idea of inheritance or legacy. And the legacy of parents is very present in the text. Mahood's father dies when she's young, so that prompts her visits to this place in the desert to reconnect with him. Liptrott's father has bipolar disorder, and when he's in rehab, she wonders if her drinking was, quote, in part an attempt to attain the manic states I'd experienced with my father. In a way, my drunkenness was an attempt to emulate and even impress, though I didn't succeed, my dad. I was wild and free and alive, end of quote. And in Lab Girl, Yaren's father is a scientist, so she spends a lot of her childhood in his lab. And initially she studies English literature. I think that's why the book's so beautifully written, to fulfill her mother's lost dreams. The mum wanted to study English, but she had to have a family first. But then Yaren goes back to science in the lab. And this idea of legacy is tied to the wider issue, the legacy of our natural environment, and the question of what we have inherited and what we are leaving for younger generations. And I think these books, in trying to chronicle what we're losing and what it means when we lose part of ourselves, is the writer's way of trying to stymie some of this loss. And the final point I want to canvass about the books is their materiality. And by that I mean the way in which the subject matter shapes how the books are written. So Position Doubtful is about a white settler colonial woman trying to articulate her strong connection to a place that has a history of violence against Aboriginal peoples and dispossession of those people as well. And it's a profoundly unsettling experience. And she's trying to work out what it's doing to her head and her vision. And that's evident in the text itself, because it doesn't have a strong narrative drive. It's disconnected. You can't work out where you are. The prose is interspersed with images and history and pieces of prose that describe imaginary scenes. So the reader, as well, is doubtful of where they are. The outline is a very tight and controlled piece of writing, and that relates to this idea of containment, the way Liptrott's trying to keep a grip on things to keep herself from spiralling out of control because of her addictive personality. And it's a powerful book because of that. There's this really concentrated energy that runs through it. And as I've explained, Yaren's book pairs each stage of the life cycle of a tree with an example of a tree and what's happening to that tree. So she talks about a sapling which, as an adolescent, grew too fast and the tree died. And she's an adolescent watching this happen to the tree, and it has a profound impact on her and the way she thinks about trees. And then when she writes the book, she names chapters according to roots, trunk, leaves and shoots. So the tree appears in the text. So in terms of where to go next, I'm looking at another writer called Eliza Brightman, who was born in 1830 and she died in 1986. And she lived in England. She got married at 25, but she had some kind of a nervous breakdown. We don't know what happened. And she was immobilised for 10 years. And then her husband died and she had a renaissance. And she started writing these natural histories about all the plants and animals and the estate on which she lived, the Grove. And it's very peculiar because she domesticates all the animals that she talks about, and then she created this living museum with specimens that she'd collected and brought them into the home because she couldn't go very far. So I'm not sure what's happening there, but it's really intriguing. She had a disability, she had a mental illness, and that's somehow shaped her writing. So as I mentioned, I need a German example, Southeast Asian example, South American example, so it's not just English-speaking nations, they'll have to get translations. So if you have any suggestions, I'd love to hear them. I'm also mostly reading and thinking about women, so if you have any suggestions for books by blokes, I would like to hear them too. I'm also interested in thoughts on potential publishers. I know the field of fiction and non-fiction, but not academic publishing. So someone like Duke University Press, but the way it's shaping up, it's a bit boring. It's just like one chapter after another. So I was thinking about putting interviews into it and also describing the environments that people move through. But that might make it less scholarly. I'm just not sure what's going to happen yet. So that's me. I'm done. I would welcome any suggestions, comments, queries, critiques, anything will be good. Thank you.